טוב, בוקר טוב לכולם ולכולן. אני באמת נרגשת לפתוח את המושב הראשון של הכנס קבלה ומודרניות, ובגלל שזה המושב הראשון אין לי אפשרות אלא לתת כמה תודות. אז בראש ובראשונה אני רוצה להודות לדוקטור אסף תמרי שלא נמצא כאן, והוא הרוח החיה והפועלת מאחורי כל האירוע המפואר הזה. ובנוסף לכך, הנה אסף, בדיוק הודיתי לך.
בבקשה.
ובנוסף לכך אני רוצה גם להודות לדוקטור יניב מזומן, מנכ"ל היד. אני נטע שרב, סגנית ראשת מכון בן-צבי, שכחתי להציג את עצמי. וזהו, אז אנחנו נתחיל. המושב הראשון שלנו היום, שכינה בתחתונים. אנחנו נעבור לפי הסדר, אנחנו נתחיל עם זוהר מאור, שידבר על פרנץ רוזנצוויג, הקבלה והשחרור מהתפיסה החילונית. יש תמסירים, אז אולי נחלק אותם. תודה. ובינתיים אני אציג את דוקטור זוהר מאור, שהוא מרצה בכיר במחלקה להיסטוריה באוניברסיטת בר אילן. שם הוא מלמד משנת 2008. תחומי המחקר שלו הם מרכז אירופה, ההיסטוריה האינטלקטואלית של מרכז אירופה, הוגים אינטלקטואלים יהודים גרמנים, חילון ודיאלוג בין דתי ועוד ועוד. הספר שלו Beyond Religion and Secularity, Post-Secular Theology Between the World Wars in Germany, התקבל לפרסום בהוצאת צאני, אז ברכות. והבמה שלך עד 20 דקות, בסדר? תודה רבה.
אולי אני אעבור בשתי דקות, סליחה.
יש לך מצגת?
כן, כן. טוב, אז קודם כל אני רוצה להתנצל אחרי שראיתי ששני הדוברים האחרים הם באנגלית, אז אמרתי שגם אני אדבר באנגלית, אבל התמסירים מסכמים את ההרצאה שלי בעברית למי שצריך, וגם יש כל הציטוטים הארוכים יופיעו פה גם באנגלית וגם בעברית, אז אני מקווה שגם מי שפחות מסתדר עם אנגלית אז יוכל להשתדר. In this lecture, I wish to demonstrate how thinker Franz Rosenzweig employed the Kabbalistic notion of the Shekhinah to express his youth secularist Gnostic theology, and later, when he renounced it, to shape his mature anti-secularist theology. I will open with presenting these two contrasting theologies based on my forthcoming book that Neta just introduced. I will not get here into the scholarly dispute on the place of the Kabbalah in Rosenzweig's thought. On the one hand, Gershom Scholem and Warren Harvey held that Rosenzweig's acquaintance with key Kabbalist text was shallow and that his thought was crystallized as a philosophical system without significant Kabbalistic impact. On the other hand, Moshe Idel and Rivka Horowitz argued that Rosenzweig addressed in his writing basic Kabbalah issues and that Kabbalistic ideas like the concept of language left a decisive mark on his thought. My discussion here is presumed on the middle way between these two opposed scholarly approaches. Rosenzweig was mainly a philosopher ingrained in German philosophy and culture, but as a post-liberal thinker deeply committed to all aspects of Jewish tradition, he was open to Kabbalistic symbolism and notions. Yet my aim here is not to explore the role of Kabbalah in Rosenzweig's thought. Rather, my focus is how Rosenzweig used a key Kabbalistic term, which he could have known even without a deep acquaintance with the Kabbalah, in his youth secularist spiritual researches, and how later he used the same term in his main work, The Star of Redemption, in an opposite way. Moreover, at this stage, the Kabbalah epitomizes for him the Jewish anti-secularist approach. But first, as promised, a clarification of the terminology is needed. Secularization refers to the historical processes diminishing religion. Secularism to ideologies justifying or promoting these processes. Secularists to thinkers generating and sponsoring these ideologies and activists performing them. Secular theologies, which is my focus finally, refers to the philosophies that seek to challenge mainstream religion by offering alternative answers to the core theological issues using recognizable theological vocabulary. This lecture focuses on this last aspect. Most importantly, most secular thinkers did not deny God. Rather, they developed heretical theological concepts of God and his relationship to the world. Michael Hayes' characterization of secularization can assist us in defining two main contrasting variants of secular theologies. Hyde, primarily exploring 17th century secularism, suggests to conceive secular theology as, quote, a serious crisis in the symbolic and institutional Jacob ladders that we just read in the parasha, connecting the world, the secular, and the divine world beyond, unquote. These ladders were built by religions seeking to bridge the, quote, chasm between the transcendental and mundane orders, unquote. Secularization, that is, the breakup of these ladders, could either lead to the distancing of God from the world or to the collapse of, quote, the distance between this world and the transcendental source of meaning, unquote. This first option yielded pantheism, the rehabilitation of paganism in identifying God with the world and repudiating the religious transcendent God. Spinoza's renewed popularity during the late imperial era, as documented by Benjamin Lazir, is related to this first secular theology opposing the God of religion and deifying nature, the cosmos, and the superhuman. The second response to the crisis of the bridging ladders was to deny God's accessibility. God is remote, indifferent to a world that remains secular. Acknowledging the secularity of the world is a theological act, as it confirms God's absolute otherness. This secular theology was often termed Gnostic after the dissenting religious streams of the early Christian era that portrayed a godless, evil world. Like pantheism, neo-Gnosticism gained prevalence in the first decade of the 20th century. The Gnostic approach, distancing God from the world, was intertwined from another focus aspect, namely in limiting religion into a specific realm of cult, while creating all other realms as secular, that is, freed from the divine presence and religious rules. Jewish secular theologians often adopted Kabbalah and Hasidism in their efforts to disengage God from the world, or conversely, to demonstrate their overlap. I've shown elsewhere how Scholem's conception of inaccessible deity as the essence of Kabbalah and its contextualization as mysticism was shaped by his secularist Gnostic approach, manifest in his youth Kabbalistic musing as documented in his diary. The young Martin Buber, constructively, suggested a highly influential pantheistic reading of Hasidism. In Judaism and the Jews from 1909, the first of his highly influential addresses on Judaism, he explicitly presented his secularist immanent approach. Just as the Jews of the old days gave their lives for the sake of the one God, the total unity, so we, living in another kind of duality, must liberate ourselves, not through devotion to God, since we no longer have God anymore, but through devotion to the foundation of our existence, to the unity of our inner essence. In this passage, the transcendent God is purportedly dead. The traditional Jewish pursuit of unity should be redirected from attempts to encounter the heavenly and turn instead to forging a connection with human interiority. In another address, Buber blended Kabbalistic notions with Spinozist pantheism to express the erasure of the divine human God. You can see here, God is inclining towards the world. His Shekhinah descends to the world in order to abide with it. Sparkles the one fell into the soul of man. Transcendent unity become immanent, the unity of the world, being God, the God of Baruch Spinoza. Buber employed the term of the Shekhinah, which indeed signifies in classical Kabbalah the immanent divine presence, to sideline the transcendent aspect of the Jewish tradition. Young Rosenzweig, who, like many post-liberal Jewish and non-Jewish, non-traditional God seekers, read eagerly Buber works, and gave the Shekhinah an opposite meaning as part of his early Gnostic faith. This faith was masterfully analyzed by Benjamin Pollock, whose pioneering studies based on Rosenzweig's unexplored early writings outlined a revised portrait of Rosenzweig's intellectual world before the star. As Pollock has shown, in his private writing, Rosenzweig designated his pre-dialogical approach as Marcionists. According to Pollock, Rosenzweig's Gnosticism was, quote, a theology that focused exclusively on the relationship between the individual soul and the divine, that is ignored or even rejected the moral and spiritual potential of the world, unquote. I, by contrast, believe that Rosenzweig doubted even the possibility of a relationship between man and God. In a 1910 letter to Rudolf Ehrenberg, Rosenzweig argued that the development of modern philosophy involves secularization, that is, the distancing of God from the world, and man's subsequent turning away from him. The Enlightenment portrayed God as enthroned in perfection in infinite distance from the world. Herder's God of history, likewise, does not engage in the world. In Rosenzweig's account of these stages, despite the emphasis on the Christian undertones of the two philosophical approaches, he employed the symbol of the exile of the Shekhinah. These seemingly philosophical accounts of a remote God are associated with the Jewish myth of a rupture between God and his hidden dwelling in the world. In the third phase, the early philosophy of Hegel, the complete immanentization of religion did not end metaphysical exile by re-engaging God. Rather, it led to the renunciation of the remote God in a more radical version of secularization. The motive of exile also appears in the Shekhinah sonnets, which Rosenzweig wrote in 1912 and never published. Rosenzweig expressed the gap between God and the world and the breakup of the bridging Jacob ladders by the Kabbalist myth of the exile of the Shekhinah. Rosenzweig hinted at the abortive relationship between the lovers in the Song of Songs as denoting the gap between man and God. While Pollock grounded the Gnostic message of the sonnets in their ending, where only a salvific death enables a reunion with God and his Shekhinah, I wish to propose an even more pessimistic interpretation. Each sonnet has a different speaker. The first three are, in order, angels, the Shekhinah, and God, and the fourth, heaven. God and the Shekhinah are caught in the exilic separation. The solution, the human sacrifice, is imported only from the heavenly perspective, recalling that according to the Kabbalah, the Shekhinah symbolizes the divine dwelling in the human, which can be interpreted as the individual, the Jewish people, or the world of humanity. The ascetic death of man as a precondition of the craved coalescence of God and the Shekhinah signifies the passing of the Shekhinah itself. Reunion is thus impossible, even in death. Thus, for young Rosenzweig, still detached of his Jewish tradition, but already interested in Kabbalistic symbolism, the Shekhinah's exile expresses God's remoteness and confirms the secularist perspective. Yet, in his mature thought, God is no longer in exile. In the years 1916, 1926, Rosenzweig, in close cooperation with Buber, whom he befriended, and Eugen Rosenstock, his friend since 1912, produced a trailblazing form of dialogical thinking and begat a new anti-secularist approach to religion and challenged the reigning secularist approaches. Dialogue renounced both the Gnostic secularist perspective of a godless world on the one hand and the pantheist image of a totally immanent God on the other. Within dialogical theology, the Gnostic gap between divine and the mundane served as a preliminary pre-revelation stage. God's miraculous revelation bridges the metaphysical gap. Moreover, dialogical theology destabilized the secularist binarism of rigid and mutually exclusive religious and secular realms. In this approach, God's revealed word, and especially the human response to it, enable living beyond the secular religious divide. Thus, in the first part of the star, Rosenzweig portrayed the pagan worldview that is the pre-revelation understanding of God, man, and world, and related them to ancient Greek culture. One of the key aspects of the pagan perspective is a strict disengagement of God, man, and word from one another. The image of a metaphysical God of the first part of the book engenders the Gnostic who avoids sundering the divine and the mundane, as Rozenzweig put it, I quote, "It would be necessary that the abyss between the human worldly and the divine be recognized and acknowledged," unquote. In the second part of the star, this void is not invalidated by revelation, but rather serve as its precondition, as it hampers the much more dangerous pantheist bounder. Only after establishing a gap between heaven and earth, it can be bridged by revelation. Revelation, Rozenzweig argued, reshape our relationship with God. Quote, "Here the shell of the mystery breaks. Everything we knew about God till now has been only knowledge of a hidden God, of a God who hid both himself and his life in his own mythical domain in the heaven of God. This God whom we know was coming to an end. Revelation, manifested in divine love, is not only the crucial move of God out of his isolation, but it also opened the hitherto enclosed human soul and thus uproots the pagan image of a concealed God. For Rozenzweig, revelation is grounded in the miracle of language, which realizes God's presence. Theological revelation, thus, walks a fine line between pantheist secular theology, which completely conflates the divine and the mundane, and Gnosticism, which leaves the word godless. Within revelation, human and divine language overlap. Thus, the prophet does not mediate between heaven and earth, but bespeaks the divine I. Language can represent the godly word, and dialogue with God in the present can parallel the traditional revealed holy text. The mute self comes of age under the love of God to become speaking soul. It was here that we had recognized revelation. If language is more than simply a comparison, if it's truly semile, and therefore more than semile, then that which we hear in our eye as living word, and that which meets our resoundingly alive from out of our you, must be also written in the great historical testimony of revelation. Once again, let us seek the word of man in the word of God. The presence of God's words in the human world erases the secularist borders between religious and secular realms. Redemption, as portrayed in the Star, Part 2, Book 3, further enables bridging God and world. As Pollock has shown, this part expresses Rozenzweig's withdrawal from the Gnostic world negation of his youth. Redemption is also the fulfillment of the reconciliation of the human and the divine enacted by revelation. Still, how could such a unification of human action and divine work take place unless the human act too, itself as act, comes from God, and unless God's work increases and is fulfilled in the awakening of man? Secular immanentism, ostensibly, discarded in the first part of the book, is redeemed here when it is no longer reconceived as being in opposition to the transcendent. In redemption, the world becomes fully alive and loses its objectified character. It is thus sanctified without losing its worldliness. In the third part of the Star, Rozenzweig demonstrated that both Christianity and Judaism follow this anti-secularist path and are thus life and not an isolated religion. In Judaism, he wrote, it is not simply such that the holy will leave the ordinary outside. The blessing, bracha, seizes all the ordinary and lets nothing remain ordinary any longer, but keeps everything holy. Yet a deeper scrutiny of the Star revealed that this is only the approach of redeemed Judaism. Exilic Judaism, conversely, is characterized by alienating itself from the ordinary. It's founded on the dichotomy between religious, holy spheres, and secular, worldly spheres. In exile, the Jew has a holy land, holy language, and holy law which differ from his homeland, vernacular, and state law. In the critical turn from exilic Judaism that almost adopts the Gnostic theology, and disengage God from world and circumscribes the relationship with God into a religion, to a redeemed Judaism that sees divine presence everywhere, Kabbalah has a key role. From the God of our fathers to the law, Jewish mysticism throws a bridge of its very own. In place of the general concept of creation, it puts that of the secret creation. The story of the chariot, מעשה מרכבה, the law does not stand unknown opposite this world, but only is the key to those riddles of the world. This is the basic idea of countless legends that, with which Judaism winded the seemingly narrow world of its law to the whole world, and on the other hand, even sees this world, the world to come. In this context, Rozenzweig revisited the symbol of Shekhinah, the divine presence. While in his 1910 sonnets, it symbolized God's gnostic inaccessibility, here it is employed to demonstrate the shift from exile to redemption. On the other hand, the Kabbalistic notion of the Shekhinah, of Shekhinah's exile, is interpreted as God's affiliation with his wandering people, the suffering of the remnant. That is, the Jewish people as insulated from the world. Quote, the concept separating and having to be eliminated. All this now becomes a suffering for God's sake, and the remnant is the bearer of this suffering, unquote. The Shekhinah, as it were, joins the Jewish enclosure and is this destination from the world. Thus, God needs redemption, which is enacted by preserving the mitzvot, explained Kabbalistically. The Jewish man fulfills the endless constants and perspectives, לשם ייחוד ושכינתה. God's glory that is scattered in countless sparks in the whole world, this he will gather from the scattering and one day bring it home. All that is now rest is vined into the whole, into the all, or rather is redeemed into the oneness of the one. The descent into the innermost is revealed as an accent to the uppermost. Hence, Rozenzweig employed the Shekhinah and the Kabbalistic concept of the Yichud to explain two Jewish responses to secular theologies. Exilic Judaism still exposes the limitation of the whole to the Arba Amot of Halacha, thus leaving the rest of the world in its secularity. Yet the notion of Shekhinah enabled to renounce the Gnostic theology, distancing God from the world. God contracts himself into the Jewish enclave. He is present here, yet by performing the halacha, the yichud happens. The Shekhinah is redeemed and expands into all the realms of life, thus fully bridging heaven and earth and curbing the borderlines between the secular and the holy. מלוא כל הארץ כבודו. Thank you.
Thank you so much. תודה רבה. אנחנו ניקח את השאלות בסוף, בסדר? כי יש בקשה לחבר את הנושאים השונים שאנחנו עוסקים בהם במושב הזה. אני שכחתי להגיד כמה דברים. שכחתי להודות בתחילת דבריי לקתדרת מתנאל ולקרן מתנאל, וגם שכחתי להגיד לכם שביום האחרון של הכנס, מאוד חשוב, יש הרצאה מקוונת. תסתכלו בעמוד האחרון. כדי לקבל את הלינק לזום של ההרצאה האחרונה, צריך להירשם בנפרד. לא להחמיץ את זה. אוקיי.
זה לא יהיה פה כאילו יוקרן ההרצאה הזאת?
זה יהיה רק בזום. כל אחד מביתו. אבל אם לא תירשם בנפרד לאירוע הזה, לא תקבל את הקישור. אז שכחתי להודיע את זה בתחילת דבריי, אז אני מודיעה את זה ואני מתנצלת על ההפרעה ברצף הדברים. עכשיו אנחנו נשמע את יעל לוי. דוקטור יעל לוי היא מרצה בכירה במחלקה להיסטוריה יהודית ויהדות בת זמננו, וראש התוכנית ליידיש. אני מתרגמת פה מאנגלית, אז אני מקווה שאני מדייקת. המחקר שלה עוסק, מתמקד בהיסטוריה חברתית ותרבותית של דוברי יידיש במאה ה-19 וה-20, הגירה יהודית, דפוס יידי, יידיש מודרנית, ספרות מודרנית. הספר הראשון שלה, The Spirit That Materials Bear, שיצא בהוצאת עירובין, הוא אוסף דו-לשוני של שירה יידית מאת דבורה פוגל, ויש לה עוד ספרים שבוודאי כדאי לראות אותם. ההרצאה שלה כרגע נקראת Kabbalistic Montage in the work of Debora Vogel and Walter Benjamin. אז יש לך 20 דקות ובהצלחה.
Hi, good morning. Today I want to discuss the Kabbalistic montage of the Polish Jewish modernist Yiddish writer Debora Vogel, and its resonance with the writing of Walter Benjamin. Vogel's work was deeply informed by Jewish mystical thought and understanding this mystical dimension is essential to grasping her distinctive contribution to Intermodernism. By comparing theoretical concepts which Vogel and Benjamin shared, we gain a new understanding of interwar Jewish thought. Born in 1900 in Bursztyn, Eastern Galicia, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, now Bursztyn, Western Ukraine, and murdered in 1942 in the Lviv ghetto, Debora Vogel was a modernist writer who moved between Yiddish, Polish, German, and Hebrew. She published 2 collections of Yiddish poetry, Tog Figuren, Day Figures in 1930, and Mannequins in 1934. But it's her 1935 collection, Acacias Blien, Acacias Bloom, Montages, published in both Yiddish and Polish, that most clearly exemplifies her Kabbalistic montage. Recent translations into German, Polish, English, French, and Hebrew have sparked renewed scholarly interest in Vogel's work. Yet despite this attention, a fundamental aspect of her literary project remains overlooked. This is her systematic engagement with Jewish mystical traditions. This is a poetic practice that fuses modernist fragmentation with Jewish mystical vocabulary to create a distinctively Jewish avant-garde aesthetics. The key to understanding Vogel's work lies in grasping her distinction between what she called superficial Jewish themes and deeper Jewish elements, a distinction she articulated clearly and repeatedly in her theoretical writing. In 1933, Vogel wrote an essay on the Polish Jewish artist Leopold Pilchowski that articulates a crucial distinction underpinning her entire aesthetic project. The essay, published in the Hebrew journal HaSolel, addressed both Pilchowski's specific work and broader questions about the nature of Jewish art. This is a translation from the Hebrew original. When considering such artists like Pilchowski, the questions of a Jewish element in art, the possibility of Jewish art whatsoever, becomes relevant once again. This Jewish element cannot be found in a Jewish theme, since the theme proved to be ridiculous and demonstrated its fragmentation. Thus, the Jewish element must be looked for in an irrational thing and yet real, something hidden in the rhythms of the line and the nuance of the image. So first, Vogel explicitly rejects Jewish themes, the depiction of a recognizably Jewish subject, scenes, or narrative. Second, and more importantly, she doesn't reject the possibility of Jewish art altogether. Instead, she relocates the Jewish element to what she calls an irrational thing and yet real. This phrase is crucial. It's not simply irrational, not purely abstract or mystical. It has ontological substance despite transcending rational categories. Third, she tells us where to look for this element, in the rhythms of the line and the nuance of the image. Not in what is depicted, but in how it's depicted. Not in subject matter, but in formal and aesthetic dimensions. The Jewish element manifests in the very structure and rhythm of artistic creation. The phrase irrational yet real and its conceptual background echoes Jewish mystical discourse about divine presence in material reality. In Kabbalistic thought, God's presence is simultaneously beyond rational comprehension and yet immanent in all things, irrational yet utterly real. When Vogel uses this specific formulation to describe the Jewish element in art, she is signaling her engagement with mystical frameworks. This theoretical position allows us to understand how Vogel could simultaneously reject conventional Jewish thematics content while deeply engaging with Jewish mystical traditions in her poetics. This theoretical framework finds its clearest expression in Vogel's use of mystical vocabulary. In her literary montage collection Acacias Blien, Acacias Bloom, Vogel systematically attributes souls using the term neshome in Yiddish, which is neshama, to raw materials. This isn't random word choice or mere poetic personification. It's a deliberate, sustained engagement with Jewish mystical tradition. In the opening montage titled The Building of a Train Station, Der Bau von einer Bahnstation, Vogel describes construction materials, and this is the English translation of the Yiddish original. Concrete. Concrete is mixed from slimy cement and the gray, detached piece of monotony. Then comes rubble, a helpless body, a sad one. Also water, which holds together empty grains of cement and rubble. Also water is dull and unlike anything. Therefore, concrete must be boring like worn-out happiness. Seeing concrete makes one cry. This is the body, but the soul of concrete is, as always, delicate and very fantastical. In the city streets, concrete is no longer a boring burden that hurts like cotton fields. Here is found the fantastical soul of concrete, the formula of its hidden life, arcades, walls, and pathways. The body of the material is juxtaposed with its soul. Within the industrial and the supposedly soulless elements of building and industry, there lies a gentle soul. The soul is discovered only in the urban realm, in city streets and buildings. Vogel's choice of Loshen Kodesh derived guf for body and neshome, soul, over Germanic alternatives signals deliberate engagement with Jewish mystical categories or metaphysical categories. More significantly, her attribution of soul to industrial materials enacts a mystical worldview where divine presence pervades even seemingly mundane matter. In the commentary tradition of the Kabbalah, neshama is a higher degree of the soul that corresponds to the divine emanation, sphira of understanding, bina. Vogel attributes neshomes, especially Jewish mystical term for soul, to the raw materials of modern industrial construction. When Vogel attributes neshama to concrete, iron, and tin, the raw materials of modernity, she is enacting this mystical worldview in her poetry. Even these industrial materials, products of modern technology and urban development, participate in the divine economy. This brings us to the form of montage. Vogel wrote extensively about montage as a literary technique, and the theoretical reflection on this form are crucial for understanding her poetics. In a 1937 essay published in the journal Boden, she wrote, this is a translation from the Yiddish original. The notion of montage already contains the term's conventional use and its principle. The combination of elements, each simultaneously an autonomous totality for itself, independent from all other elements, into a whole. Vogel's montage juxtaposes seemingly disparate urban fragments, train stations, mannequins, construction materials, arcades, trees, and revealed the hidden unity through a language of neshome. The montage form becomes a mystical practice of gathering scattered divine sparks, of recognizing the sacred in the profane. This understanding of montage as a mystical practice, connects Vogel to a contemporary Walter Benjamin, who was working with remarkably similar ideas at the same time. Both were developing Kabbalistic approaches to modernist aesthetics in the 1930s. However, the parallel practices reveal a deeper pattern. What Benjamin does with time, Vogel does with space. Benjamin, the arcade project, which he worked on from 1927 until his death in 1940, and which Vogel didn't know, of course, uses montage to interrupt linear historical time. He called this interruption chips of messianic time, moments when the past suddenly comes into the present, when commodity culture reveals its dreamlike qualities, when the material world flashes with spiritual significance. As he wrote in his thesis on the philosophy of history, history contains a weak messianic power that can break through chronological time to reveal hidden connections. For Benjamin, montage becomes a method of temporal interruption. By juxtaposing quotations, observation, and fragments from 19th century Paris, he creates what he called dialectical images, moments where past and present collide to illuminate each other. The montage form allows him to insert mystical time, messianic time, into secular time, which is linear history. This is, for example, Benjamin's treatment of iron in the Arcade project. The technical absolutism that is fundamental to iron construction and fundamental merely on account of the material itself becomes apparent to anyone who recognizes the extent to which it contrasts with traditional conception of the value of the utility of building materials. Iron inspired a certain distrust that just because it wasn't immediately furnished by nature, but instead had to be artificially prepared as a building material. Benjamin sees in iron construction a material that has been transformed, that carries both its industrial present and a hidden spiritual dimension. But his focus is temporal, how this material embodies historical change, how it connects different moments in time. Vogel's practice mirrors Benjamin's, but in a spatial register, where Benjamin interrupts chronological time with messianic time, Vogel interrupts physical space with mystical elements. The same way that Benjamin inserts weak messianic power into the linear course of history, Vogel inserts neshamas into material reality. Her montages don't move through time, but through urban space, train stations, construction sites, city streets, and arcades. This spatial temporal distinction helps explain why both writers needed montage as their chosen form. Katarzyna Weichert argues that Benjamin and Vogel chose the montage genre to express the individual's modern experience, using text to reflect everyday reality while rejecting hierarchies between important and unimportant things. While this is true, the resemblance goes even deeper. For both Benjamin and Vogel, montage is not merely a stylistic choice, but an enactment of a mystical vision, a way of revealing hidden unity through fragmentation. Both practices stem from the same mystical insight, that apparent fragmentation conceals hidden wholeness, that the profane contains the sacred. In this sense, their parallel but distinct practices suggests that Jewish mysticism provided flexible resources for thinking about modernity, resources that could be adapted to address either temporal or spatial dimensions of modern experience. The scholarly consensus has been that Vogel's modernism was divorced from Jewish tradition, that she chose the avant-garde over Jewish cultural references. I've tried to show here that this reading fundamentally misunderstands Vogel projects. This misreading happens because scholars look for obvious Jewish themes, like explicit references to Jewish life, ritual, or language, and when they don't find them, conclude that Vogel has abandoned Jewish tradition. But this approach misses what Vogel herself theorized as essential, the difference between Jewish themes and Jewish elements. When we attend to a systematic use of mystical vocabulary, particularly her attribution of neshama to industrial materials, and when we understand her montage practice through the lens of Kabbalistic thought about fragments and wholeness, a very different picture emerges. The comparison with Walter Benjamin demonstrates that Vogel wasn't working in isolation. Both writers and others like Schultz, Chagall, and others independently developed Kabbalistic approaches to modernist aesthetics, and their parallel practices, Benjamin's temporal interruption and Vogel's spatial interruption, reveal the depth and flexibility of Jewish mystical resources for engaging with modernity. By locating the Jewish element in the rational yet real, both could be simultaneously read as purely modernist and as deeply engaged with Jewish mystical traditions. This comparative framework reveals something crucial. Jewish mysticism in the interwar period wasn't a retreat from modernity, but a way of comprehending it. The Kabbalistic concepts of fragmentation and repair provided powerful tools for thinking about the shattered experience of modern Jewish life. This has broader implications for how we understand Jewish modernism in the interwar period. First, it suggests that we need to be more attentive to non-obvious forms of Jewish engagement in modernist works. Writers can draw deeply on Jewish traditions without depicting obvious Jewish subjects or scenes. Second, it revealed that Jewish mysticism wasn't merely a source of exotic imagery for modernist writers. Rather, mystical concepts provided philosophical frameworks for thinking about modernity, fragmentation, materiality, and the relationship between the particular and the universal. Third, this challenges the common narrative that modernism required a break from tradition. Vogel and Benjamin show us that it is possible to be radically modern and deeply traditional simultaneously, not by preserving tradition unchanged, but by actively reworking it for new contexts. Vogel's spatial montage and Benjamin's temporal montage are both authentically Jewish and authentically avant-garde. They demonstrate that the mystical and the modern are not opposites, but complementary modes of perceiving hidden dimensions of reality. Recognizing these mystical dimensions help us understand the unique syntax and vocabulary of Jewish modernism in interwar Europe. It suggests that the question we should ask is not whether modernist Jewish writers abandoned tradition, but rather how they transformed it and how, in turn, mystical traditions transformed their modernism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I assume you already feel, כבר מרגישים את הקווי דמיון, שאלות רוחב. ועכשיו אנחנו נעבור להרצאה השלישית. So, the last presentation for today, the title of which is Sholem's Kafka, a Kabbalist for Modernity, is going to be presented by Dr. Steven Weinberg, a scholar of German languages and literature, Jewish studies, and law. He earned his PhD from Rutgers University, where his dissertation on Ersatz Kabbalah examined hope and failure in the works of Kafka, Benjamin, and Sholem was submitted. He also holds a JD from Temple Law School and an MA in literature from Ben-Gurion University in the Negev, where he wrote his thesis on natural law jurisprudence in Kafka's The Trial. Dr. Weinberg works at the Stiftung Neue Synagoge at the Zentrum Judaicum in Berlin. His presentation today, which I just said, is based on his article recently published in the journal Naharaim. Additionally, he's the host of the podcast, The Schrift, which analyzes the Torah through the lens of the German literary tradition. Sounds really great. The floor is yours. Okay?
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for having me at this conference. So this is a presentation I'm giving on Sholem's conception of Franz Kafka. And as mentioned, this was published in the journal Naharaim. If you're interested in learning more, you can check that article out. So, Franz Kafka was hugely important to Sholom's conception of the Kabbalah. He once famously said, to understand the Kabbalah, you need to read Franz Kafka, particularly his novel, The Trial. Ironically, though, he wrote very little about Kafka. In order to discern his Kafka views, we have to look at a few sources. His letter exchange with Walter Benjamin throughout the 1930s, where they debated Kabbalah. The 10th aphorism of his 10 unhistorical aphorisms on the Kabbalah, where he writes explicitly about Kafka, and just a few pages here and there in some of his more popular works on the Kabbalah written later in his life, toward the end of his life. So essentially, to figure out what Sholem thought about Franz Kafka, we really have to kind of be detectives and try to put the pieces together. Essentially, Sholem observed a tension in Kafka's literature. On one hand, if anyone who's read Kafka, there's nothing about in The Trial or in The Castle, in these famous novels, there's no God ostensibly. There's no law, there's no overt signs of Judaism. If we take Kafka in this light, then he seems to be writing about atheistic worlds, nihilistic worlds, where God is dead. However, Sholem also observed what he saw as faint signs, faint hints of God, of religion, of Judaism. So Sholem was trying to make sense of this tension. And just some examples of these are in The Trial, and The Trial, Kafka's The Trial was the work Sholem was most interested in. Of course, we have this striving for the law. Joseph K., the main character, is obsessed with legal systems. And also even in America, his earlier novel, there's a famous law student opening law books. So Sholem saw these as signs of this lost world of Judaism and law. And there are also these moments of light. In The Trial, for example, in the parable, The Man Before the Law, when the man asks for access to the law, he at the end of the story, a ray of light appears from under the doorway to the law. Sholem wanted to resolve this tension, and he found it in the Kabbalistic idea of the Tzimtzum. The Tzimtzum is one of the most prominent aspects of the Kabbalah, derived from the beliefs of Isaac Luria. The idea that in order to create the universe, God needed to shrink in upon himself to create essentially an emptiness and a darkness where he could infuse his light to create the world. So essentially, to create something, to create life, to create the universe, you needed darkness, you needed nothingness. Again, this sort of tension. And as I will explain in the next slide, Sholem believed that Kafka's world was one in which the Tzimtzum was at its lowest ebb, where God is not dead but asleep. And this would make Kafka, for Sholem, not a heretical nihilist, as he might seem to be on the surface, but what Sholem would call him a pious atheist or a secular Kabbalist. But let me explain more about what I mean about the Tzimtzum at its lowest ebb, what that exactly means. So Sholem, growing up in Berlin, was so influenced by Hegel and the notion of the dialectic And he took this idea of the historical dialectic and applied it to Tzimtzum. And this historical dialectic runs throughout Sholom's thought, and also his thought on Kafka. So he saw Jewish history as moving dialectically between lightness and darkness. That the Tzimtzum, just like in this first moment when darkness had to be graded to give way to light, Sholem saw this throughout history, where there were periods in Jewish history where Jews had no access to the law, were totally estranged from the religion, where there seemed to be no signs of God or hope. And then in the next period, there would be a kind of Aufhebung, to use Hegel's terminology, and this light and this religion would return. And Sholem, as mentioned, he didn't just apply this to Kafka, but also to other periods of history. And most provocatively and perhaps famously, he used the Star of David as an example, that this was the sign that Jews wore in Second World War and the Holocaust to the abyss of genocide. And it was this same sign, the Star of David, which they would later raise as a flag of the Jewish state in Israel. So he saw Kafka's world as at the very, very bottom of this wave. He uses the term wave actually in his correspondence with Walter Benjamin, and that Kafka was on the nadir of this wave, on the valley of the wave, as opposed to being at the peak. So Sholem, we can really see this idea of Kafka play out in his letter exchange with Walter Benjamin. They argue vehemently with each other in the 1930s about Kafka, and particularly what Kafka's view was on the law. And in many respects, they agreed, because Benjamin believed that Kafka's literature showed a world without law, a prehistoric world where law had been destroyed. And Sholem wrote to Benjamin, I agree with 98% of what you say, but you went too far. You threw the baby out with the bathwater. Essentially what Sholem is trying to say here is Benjamin missed that there's some remnant of law in Kafka, this ember that is being held onto. And the reason Sholem was so adamant about this is because this was central to his Kafka theory, that there's something left, some ember of light left in Kafka's world that will one day resurrect itself. And they also often argue about nothingness. That's a central term of art that gets used in the letter exchange. And again, for Sholem, when he's using this word, he's referring to the Tzimtzum at its nothing state where all seems to be lost. One of the reasons for their letter exchange was that they were both going to be publishing about Kafka in the Berlin newspaper Die Jüdische Rundschau around the turn of 1935, and Benjamin would write his famous Kafka essay on the 10th anniversary of Kafka's death. Kafka had died in 1924, 10 years earlier. And Sholem published a poem about Kafka. And the poem is very cryptic, mysterious, but actually, quite frankly, if you read it with this theory in mind, which I'm proposing, it becomes very obvious what Sholem's trying to say. And this is just one. I have offered one verse, but we see in this verse that the theory that it's a dark world where some light is breaking through in the Kafkan world. And not only that, but Sholem makes many references, uses his diction, his word choice is based on terms from the trial, like the law, the court, for example. And here, this image of the light breaking forth seems to me to be a very clear reference to the light coming forth under the door to the law in the parable, the man before the law. So we get Sholem's most explicit views on Kafka in his 10th aphorism, his 10th unhistorical aphorism on the Kabbalah. Even this is very cryptic. And he wrote this in 1958. And he begins by discussing the Frankist movement and its leader in Prague, or its a descendant of its movement in Prague, Jonas Vela. And on the surface, again, one thinks, okay, Sholem's comparing Kafka to Frankism, to these destroyers of the law, these rebels, these essentially kind of perhaps nihilistic people. And he even uses the term a sympathy of souls. Perhaps there's a sympathy of souls between Kafka and the Frankists. And actually, in the scholarship, I've noticed that some scholars have read this on its at face value and argued that Sholem saw Kafka as this heretical nihilist, as this atheistic writer. And actually, Sholem was trying to do the exact opposite with this aphorism in my reading. That he was trying to distinguish Kafka from the Frankist movement. But it's tricky because Sholem wants to emphasize how close Kafka was, how much he was on the border between nihilism and religion. And he says that explicitly. I have a quote here. Kafka, without parallel, expressed the border between religion and nihilism. And for this reason, his writings, in their secular depiction of a Kabbalistic world feeling, had for some contemporary readers something of the austere radiance of the canonical, of the perfection which breaks apart. This is the end of his aphorism. And again, this concept of the border was crucial to Sholem's thought, that he went as far as he could go toward nihilism without crossing over. And for Sholem, again, ironically, this is actually evidence of how, in a strange way, hopeful the Kafka world is, Kafka's novels were in Sholem's eyes. Again, a very cautious hope, a very guarded hope, a muted hope, but still something that Sholem viewed optimistically. Of course, there's also a cultural and historical component to this. Sholem wasn't writing about Kafka in a vacuum, and he wasn't comparing him to the Frankists in a vacuum. Sholem believed that the Frankists, in their destruction of the law, gave birth to the assimilationist Jewry of the 19th century. That Jews that the Frankists, in their destruction of the law, they created a world where Jews assimilated, became secular. And this is the world that Kafka and Sholem were born into. Kafka born 1883, Sholem 1897. And although this generation didn't have access to the law, in a sense literally, both Sholem and Kafka grew up without a Jewish education, or a very superficial one. They had this longing, this mourning for this lost world. At least this is how Sholem viewed his life, without question. And again, distinguishing his generation from previous generations, which had destroyed the law, neither has Judaism, neither has law, but for totally different reasons. And Sholem viewed himself and Kafka as again, mourning and trying to recover what had been lost, as trying to feel their way out of the destruction which the Frankists had brought. And in no way should, even though he writes sympathy of souls, he means this tongue-in-cheek. They're connected for very, they're connected, but they have very different objectives. So I'd just like to share quickly my opinion about this. I agree with Sholem that there is this longing in Kafka, that there are these embers of Judaism and law. I think that is certainly is for me very clear reading Kafka. And also this is just knowing Kafka's life. In many ways he was like Sholem, curious about Judaism. He learned Hebrew later in life. He wanted to immigrate to Palestine then. And he was part of the same generation. And this comes through in his literature as well. I don't think it makes sense to me that he reads him this way, and it reflects his biography. Where I disagree with Sholem is in this Hegelian outlook that this darkness is, and this light, these moments of light, is somehow evidence or signage of a hopeful future that might be coming. Kafka famously said to Max Brod, "There's plenty of hope, but not for us." I don't think Kafka saw a bright, radiant future for Judaism or for the Jews of Europe. So that's my presentation. Thank you, and
Thank you so much.
yes.
Thank you. What we're going to do now is we're going to invite the speakers back onto the stage, and we're going to have some a Q&A session. אפשר לשאול בעברית, ונשחק עם זה ככה. אוקיי? בוקר טוב, יניב. טוב, אז ניקח כמה שאלות. כן, אסף.
So I have two questions which I think are relevant for everyone here. One is the question of what is lost. In a sense, and this has a lot to do with the question of secularism and so on, what we have as a concept of the Shekhinah, or even of God's immanence in the world, is a very diluted concept in comparison to the richness of the history of this concept. One, for example, in Debora Vogel's writing, which are really fascinating, and I didn't know them, there is, of course, the lamentation and an optimism, but it's very close to animism. I mean, maybe closer to animism than to the exiled Shekhinah as she's portrayed in tradition and so on. Not to say that this is less of a use of the Shekhinah, but to the question of what is lost. The same, I think, is for Rozenzweig in your paper, Zohar, which in a sense goes back to the Rambam's Shekhinah and overlooks the Kabbalistic Shekhinah. The personhood of the Shekhinah is completely thrown away, relegated, I don't know, for just the question of immanence in a very epistemological, I would say, turn. So that's one part of my question. Why is the crying mother disappearing? And that connects to my other half of the question. I think in all presentation there's the Hasidic interpretation of the Shekhinah with its epistemological emphasis is very much felt. In the end, there is the question, what is changed? What is redeemed? And it appears to be the self. In all cases, to some extent. I mean, and perhaps this is the most secular approach that can be imagined. So the question of the self as the center is perhaps my question here. Yeah,
Wonderful. So let's try and get.
As I understand, the question is what has been lost in the what has been lost that can't be recovered. Am I understanding the question correctly?
Yeah, what he said is that once it seems like there's a translation of the idea of into modernity. I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing you here completely. That what is redeemed in the end is the self, and all the richness of the idea of the divine, whatever, is really becomes very, very, very thin. Animism is it's very thin. That's what. Did I understand you correctly?
Just enough.
Just enough. Okay, I'm sorry. I wasn't trying.
That's fine.
That was the.
It was a performance of the question.
It was a very long question. Okay, so that was if you could have any ideas to say about that.
I can just say, reading Sholem, his theory on Kafka in terms of the self, it's so, in a way, disappointing, but also exhilarating that it's so much about Sholem, the way he reads him. It's so much about Sholem's life as he's essentially, Nietzsche once said, there's no philosophy, just autobiography. Like every philosophy is an autobiography. I think Sholem is writing his own autobiography as a German Jew that grew up without the law and grew up learning Hegel, essentially being fed Hegel with a spoon in Berlin, in pre-war Berlin, talking about Hegel with Benjamin, and this, what really lasts from his philosophy of Kafka is his own autobiography of a Hegelian, an assimilated Jew that managed to break out of this world of secularization and move to Israel and become a Kabbalist. I hope that maybe answers to some extent.
Yes, thank you. I think it does. Yael, do you want to try?
Yeah. So I think the question of what is lost is really essential for Vogel, because writing in the 30s in Poland in Yiddish, so much is lost and so much is about to be lost. So really maybe the question is what remains, what is there after all. And I think for Vogel the answer is the ability to look and see, to look at a line in a Jewish piece of art, to look at the street and see a soul, the soul of cement or the tree or whatever. Really to look at this, maybe the most essential essence of things, beyond and despite all that is lost. I think this is her, I would say, her philosophy, really to look at the essential essence of life when the world collapses around her.
Okay, we speak in English for the sake of Stephen. Okay. Thank you, Asaf. I think that following your question, I want to distinguish between Scholem and Kafka on the one hand, and Vogel that I only know thanks to your lecture, and Rozenzweig, let's say the mature Rozenzweig. Okay, for Kafka writes, as Stephen quoted, that I am the end, but it's not the end that everything ends. It means that something new begins, but what begins is darkness. And Kafka did his best to portray this darkness. It's a light, but it means it's like in Tzimtzum. We know high above the light is in fact darkness. So, and this is I call it a secular theology because it assumes that God is nothingness, and this is something very crucial for the very influential Scholem's portrait of Kabbalah. And Scholem was a Zionist, and he believes that the Jewish people may renew itself, but the Kabbalah is over. And he wrote us on many occasions, the Kabbalah is over. Something mysticism is over. The Galut has no longer the sparks. The Galut lost the sparks. And Rozenzweig and Vogel, I think, try to, let's say, to build an alternative to this option. Again, Scholem leaves the exiles and go to the land of Israel, and Rozenzweig stays in exile because he believes that the Shekhinah is here. Now, you're correct. The personal images of the Shekhinah, of the mother, which is very important, is lost. You're right. Because Rozenzweig is a philosopher and he's writing a book of philosophy. But nevertheless, okay, if you think that the world is full of God, that everything is alive, and I think that these songs of Vogel are wonderful because in a way they implement the idea of the star, that the world is not a world of objects, it's a world of life. This is a redeemed world. So for Rozenzweig, there is the exilic Jewish existence, which is devoid of God, and thus, okay, again, the shrinking of something very, very small, but we all pray that it will expand and make all the world sacred. So I think that is something not very small, something very, very big. The only question, if we give it a chance, okay? But I think that there is a difference between those two options.
So thank you for these three really great papers. I'm wondering if we may perhaps go to a different central Hasidic concept and the figure of the tzaddik and how he might play a role here. You talked about the concrete, the work of art. Zohar, the law comes into play as well for Kafka. And I'm trying to, I'd like to hear your views on each of these figures, kind of self-reflexive understanding of their own position, perhaps as proto-tzaddikim for, theurgically perhaps unleashing the mystical into the world. I'm thinking of the castle with the theurgists and Josephine the singer, the rabbi. I'm thinking of Rozenzweig's depiction of the artist and art, which I think comes closest to his proto-tzaddik figure. And I don't know so much about Vogel, so perhaps you can illuminate me.
Okay, great. Return the microphone, and whoever wants to jump in first and respond. Thank you, Ezra, for your question. Stephen, did you hear that? Did you hear the question?
Yes.
Great.
Yes, I did.
Thank you. Who wants to jump in first? Anyone?
I can only say that this is a wonderful question, something that I need to investigate. Okay, I never thought about what Rozenzweig or Bub has to say about the tzaddik. So this is a beginning of a wonderful new paper. So thank you. Thank you for that.
Yael, you want to try? You don't have to if you have nothing to add.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay, Stephen, do you want to say something about that?
I guess I can just, I totally, I really love the idea of focusing on Kafka's artist figures. That's a fascinating topic for me. I'm trying to think about the connection between Sadiq and an artist. I guess I would just say I think Kafka's artists are often sacrificial figures. I think particularly of the hunger artist, who essentially his art was not eating, was starving, was turning into nothingness. But I think with Kafka, these artists were always sort of comic figures, sort of clowns, and I think that's sort of a tension with the tzaddik in Kafka. That's.
Thank you. That was a great answer. Aviram, you want to come up? Thank you, Stephen.
Sure.
לא, אי אפשר. לא ישמעו.
אני אשאל בעברית. אז השאלה הראשונה לזוהר היא לגבי ההקשר של הדיון בשכינה. אתה דיברת באמת על ההקשר יותר של האימננציה וטרנסצנדנציה, ואני תוהה גם איפה זה נקשר לדיונים שהיו סביב שלילת המימד הנשי של הקיום היהודי והמימד הקבלי של הדבר הזה, נגיד ויינינגר וילינק שרואה את הזיהוי בין כנסת ישראל לשכינה כבסיס להתגור העמדה הזאת, אפילו אם אני חושב על הספר של הרב אהרון שמואל תמרס של כנסת ישראל ומלחמות הגויים שיוצא בדיוק בתקופה הזאת כעמדת ביקורת פוליטית, כלומר המקום שבו המושג של שכינה, כנסת ישראל, מלכות, עלת למיגר מכלום, הוא בסיס לביקורת פוליטית של הקיום היהודי כנגד הקיום של מדינות הלאום בעידן של לאחר מלחמת העולם הראשונה. זה דבר אחד. וליעל רציתי לשאול, לצד היהודיות של פוגל, לגבי הגליצאיות שלה, או היהודיות הגליצאית שלה. כי אם אני חושב למשל, אפילו הדיבור על אומנות ויזואלית, והמחשבה על סימבוליזם והעיר. כן, אני חושב על ציירים יהודים שלומדים אצל קלימט בווינה, ועל מימדים של סימבוליזם ועירוניות כמו אצל משורר יהודי וינאי כמו אצל הוגו פון הופמנשטל. כלומר, זה איזושהי זירה שנשמעת לי כמו משהו שהוא גם, יש לו איזשהו קשר, למרות שהיא נמצאת כבר אחרי התפרקות האימפריה האבסבורגית, אבל עדיין לבוב נושאת איזושהי מורשת כזו.
תודה.
תודה רבה, אבירם. זה גם כן שאלה מקסימה. כן. זה נפלט השכינה, אוקיי? שאלה שפותחת המון מרחבים, ואני אנסה לענות עליה מאוד מאוד בקיצור. אני חושב שבשורה התחתונה, הדמות זאת אומרת, אין ספק שהדימוי הגברי-נשי הוא מאוד מרכזי בכוכב הגאולה, אבל כשרוזנצוויג מדבר על היהדות, הוא מדבר על דמות גברית, מדבר על הסבא והנכד. אוקיי, אגב, הוא לא מדבר על האבא, כי אבא הוא מבחינתו, הוא בגד, כתוב איזשהו מכתב בגד בעברת המסורת אליו, יש להם רק סבא ונכד. והדמות שמבטאת את מקבל ההתגלות היא בראש ובראשונה אישה. זה מאוד מאוד בולט. אבל האישה הזאת היא לא יהודייה, ופה זה קשור כמובן לכל התסבוכת שלו מול גריטלי. אוקיי, נושאים מאוד מאוד מסובכים שלא כל ספק, והחוקרות כתבו על זה, מישביץ ואחרים, על ככה שהקשר שלו עם גריטלי ממש עיצב את האופן שבו ההתגלות נוצרת ומתקבלת ושיר השירים וכך הלאה. וזה מדהים שהוא לא יצר את החיבור. זאת אומרת, הוא בוודאי ידע מספיק קבלה בשביל להבין שהשכינה היא דמות נשית, וככל שאני זוכר ובדקתי, ושוב, זו הזמנה לקריאה אולי יותר מעמיקה ויותר מתוחכמת של המושג הזה, זה מדהים שהוא מתעלם מהנקודה הזאת, שוב, באופן לא מפתיע, מכיוון שהדיבור שלו על העם היהודי, הוא עדיין דיבור גברי. ואתה מציע רעיונות נהדרים, שלכאורה ממש מתאימים לצורת המחשבה שלו, ואולי זה יותר וזה בוודאי לא מקרי שרוזנצוויג לא משתמש, לפחות ככל שאני יודע, לא משתמש ברעיונות האלה, שהוא מתוך התסבוכת הזאת שיש לו עם הממד הנשי. אבל מבחינתי זה הזמנה לעיון יותר עמוק, עוד קריאה בספר הזה, שאתה יודע, הפוך בו והפוך בו, ותמיד תמצא דברים חדשים. תודה.
כן, תודה. קודם כל, בוודאי, זאת אומרת, גדלה, חיה כמעט כל חייה בלבוב, עוד לפני קריסת האימפריה, וברחה עם המשפחה לווינה בתקופת המלחמה, ואז חזרה ללבוב, וההשפעה גם הגרמנית וגם הפולנית הייתה מאוד חזקה אצלה, וגם הצד האומנותי, כמו שהערת, היא הייתה חברה בארטס, בקבוצת אוונגרד של אומנות פולנית, בין המלחמות, וטילה באירופה, וספגה השפעות אומנותיות שונות, וגם ראתה את עצמה זאת אומרת, בצדק, כאומנית ומבקרת אומנות. מה שהיא עושה עם המונטאז' זה איזשהו פיתוח של רעיון שקיים כמובן באומנות פלסטית, והיא מעתיקה אותו אל הספרות, אל השירה. אז מהבחינה הזאת אני חושבת שאפשר לראות את ההשפעה של גליציה גם ברב תרבותיות האינרנטית שיש לה, שהיא בת בית, גם בסביבה הגרמנית וגם בסביבה הפולנית, במידה מסוימת גם בעברית וביידיש, אבל לצד כלומר בת בית וגם זרה. אולי זה גם מאפיין שלה, זאת אומרת, עם איזושהי שייכות וזרות גם יחד, זאת אומרת, הבחירה ביידיש למשל כשפה רביעית עבורה, והבחירה לכתוב ולפרסם ביידיש, לתרגם מיידיש וליידיש, וגם הייתה שותפה בכתב עת של ספרות יידיש בגליציה, זאת אומרת, ככה הם קראו לעצמם, למרות שזה היה כבר אחרי המלחמה, אבל ראו את עצמן, פוגל ורחל אוירבך, שהייתה איתה מאורחות כתב העת, כאיזשהו ניסיון לחדש או להרים את קרנה של תרבות יידיש בגליציה. ככה הן כותבות סוף שנות ה-20 ותחילת שנות ה-30, כשגליציה כיחידה פוליטית כבר לא קיימת, זאת אומרת, גם בתפיסה העצמית שלה, אני חושבת שזה מאוד ברור שהיא ראתה את עצמה כחלק מהסביבה הזאת, וגם התכתבה עם סופרי יידיש בניו יורק שהיו יוצאי גליציה, זאת אומרת, בפירוש ראתה את עצמה חלק מהמרחב הזה, גם מבחינה לשונית, גם מבחינה תרבותית, וגם מבחינה, אולי אפשר להגיד פוליטית, במובן שהיצירה שלה היא פוליטית. ואני רוצה גם לומר שוב שזה זמנה לשיחה יותר מעמיקה על הנושא הזה, כי אני חושבת שזה מאוד מאוד חשוב ופותח, זה מפתח להבין את העבודה שלה בצורה שונה.
תודה, אני ראיתי שיש עוד שאלות, אבל נגמר לנו הזמן, אז לכן אתם מוזמנים להמשיך את הדיון המרתק הזה בהפסקת הקפה. Thank you, Stephen, for a wonderful paper. תודה ליעל, תודה לזוהר על התחלה מצוינת ליום הזה, ומחיאות כפיים. תודה.
תודה, מרתק.